Welcome to the 10th in a series of shows addressing Brookline as an age-friendly community. In 2012, the World Health Organization of the United Nations selected Brookline as its first city to be designated an age-friendly city in New England. That was due to a whole set of factors that was supported by Brookline residents, the Board of Selectmen, the town administrative departments, and a set of volunteer agencies that provided leadership. Today, we're going to address a whole new area, housing for seniors in Brookline. And we're lucky to have as a guest, Len Fishman. Len is the director of the Gerontology Institute of UMass Boston Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies. Prior to that, Len was the CEO of Hebrew Senior Life, and while Len was there, he brought in 9 locations to Greater Boston and expanded Hebrew Senior Life's presence in New England. Prior to that, Len was the CEO and president of Leading Age, a coalition of nonprofits that focus on aging issues in D.C. Len was also the commissioner of the Department of Health in New Jersey under Governor Christine Todd Whitman. Welcome, Len.
Thank you, Matt. It's good to be here.
Oh, I'm glad you're here. This is a big issue. We're going to be discussing this in many shows going forward. But just to set the background, right? Aging in this country, obviously there are more and more people. Can you just give us a picture of where we are?
Sure. I think the most important thing to begin with is by talking about the longevity bonus, which is this extra 30 years of life that we have been given in just the last 100 years. People are living 30 years longer than at any time through human history. 100 years is like the blink of an eye in human history, and we are the pioneers of this new era. And while many people have been living into their 80s and 90s for some time, most of them arrived at that age unexpectedly.
Right.
What's different now is that people my age, say I'm 65, are expecting to live into their 80s and 90s, and some of them are planning for it in a way that has never happened before. And that's a great big difference when you're actually not just living longer, but expecting to and planning for it. And there have been, particularly in the housing area, many trends that we can see the beginning of. Some we can't yet, but some we can, and I guess we'll talk about some of those.
Yeah, I think this is, I can sense that. I sense it myself. I sense it in the people I see around me. The people that were aging and had made plans, and they moved certain places, and then they had a new career or a new direction or a new plan or a change in their lifestyle, and now they're looking to live another place. So, you live different places in your life depending on where you are. And I can see that. I can really sense what you're describing in myself, my friends, my relatives, the same kind of situation. So, yeah, I'm with it. So that's the national picture in the sense of housing. Is there a demand that's growing nationally? As we have in Brookline? I know we have it in Brookline.
Yes, the answer is, as I think most people know by now, every day 10,000 people reach age 65, and about 14% of our population today is 65 or older. By the year 2030, it'll be over 20%. So this is a phenomenon that's brand new in human existence. And we're, by the way, one of the younger developed countries. The countries of Western Europe, Japan, considerably older than we are, and they're dealing with these issues ahead of us. When we talk about senior housing, it's important to remember that 3/4 of seniors 65 and over live in their own homes that they own. Another 15% live in homes or apartments that they rent. So the vast majority of people are living in the same kind of housing that younger people live in. The older you get, the more likely you are to find seniors living in congregate settings of various kinds. So I'll describe.
So that's something that's actually driving them. I mean, if they're living, they didn't get there by accident. They wanted to live in congregate. I hope. I mean, I hope that people are making decisions. And
generally speaking, that's the case.
Right.
But one subset, a small subset of congregate housing, is assisted living and nursing homes, and those are settings people typically choose because they need them, not necessarily because they want them.
Right.
But so here's, I think, one of the really interesting trends is the increase in multi-generational households. You know, in the year 1900, about 2/3 of Americans lived in a home that had 3 or more generations under one roof.
Right.
For all of the last century, that percentage dropped. It bottomed out at about 12%, and then started going up again in the 90s. We're now at around 17%, and
Is that right?
will probably be closer to 20% soon. And that's for a number of reasons. One we know is that kids often move back home after college. Mm-hmm. But there are also some cases, this is still anecdotal, we don't have hard data on this, where seniors are sitting down with their kids and talking about living in a home together. One couple I know that live in Newton were living in the home they raised their kids in, way too big for them. Meanwhile, a son and daughter-in-law were about to renovate a tiny house, and they said to the son and daughter-in-law, why don't you instead sell your house, move in with us, use the renovation money to create separate living quarters.
Right.
And the implicit understanding, maybe explicit understanding, was that as the parents age, the kids living under the same roof would help. And when the parents die, the home will become the kids. Now, that's back to what I was saying about the longevity bonus and preparing for a reality that people weren't thinking about 10 or 15 years ago. And it was a very intelligent choice from an economic point of view and a social point of view to do that. And anecdotally, we're hearing more cases where older adults in their 70s, 80s are doing that kind of planning with their kids. So multi-generational households are increasing. We also, many people have heard the term naturally occurring retirement communities, or NORCs. Okay. These are apartment buildings or condominiums. They weren't designed as senior housing, but they tend to attract older adults who live there for decades, and over time, basically they become retirement communities. An advantage of a NORC is that it's more cost-effective to bring services into a building where you have a high density of seniors living, and we'll talk maybe more about that a little later. The fact that so much more care is now being brought into people's homes makes it possible for them to age in place. If they really want to stay in the house that they raised their kids in, they can get some assistance by paying an agency or an individual to come in and help them. We hear about shared housing and co-housing. The difference being shared housing is typically where 2 or more older adults will decide that they want to live in one conventional house. Co-housing is where people will actually get together and plan to build a small development where the houses are individual, but they share things, perhaps like a kitchen, a community room, maybe laundry facilities. So they're keeping their private residences, but they also are living in community with others. And then, of course, there's continuing care retirement communities, subsidized senior housing.
But I'm hearing the types of things, but I'm hearing drivers. I mean, there's people who want to be with their family. They want to be with families. They want to be with friends, right? Mm-hmm. People don't want to be alone. They want to now get together with others. People want to services where they're living now. They'd rather not move, but they want to make sure they have the services. So I'm hearing all of these inner things that I feel and I see others feel and concerned about. We didn't mention, but physically, location. I mean, if I'm suddenly in an isolated area, that might matter a lot to me to be not isolated anymore.
So what you're identifying, Matt, are the two great tensions that seniors try to figure out how to balance, which is the very strong desire to remain in the home they've been in for many years, and the other desire to be in community. And these are in conflict, and I think what the choices seniors make is based largely on how they weigh the importance of those two things.
Okay, I can see that. I can see that. I certainly went through times where I said, well, maybe I want to live in a bigger place, but I'd be far away from people. In each case, the same thing comes up. What do I want? Do I want some personal comfort, or do I want community? So I can see that happening. And that drives the choices from what you're describing. Each of the things you describe is something that people... Now, I realize you could find yourself in those situations, but people choose too. At least in my case, I certainly moved from one place to another over my lifetime as things changed. You're describing changes that would cause moves.
Yes. But what's different when you're older, typically, is that for most of the moves you made, you were either experiencing an increase in income, so you were feeling probably pretty good financially. For people who have retired and are living on fixed incomes, the options become more limited. And it's harder to find exactly the right option.
But it's still a change, but now we're looking at either downsizing, changing affordability, looking at what can you afford, what can't you. I could see the driving. I'm not...
Speaking of driving, it's not the way in which you were using the term, but something that's also important. I talked about 3/4 of seniors living in their own homes and 90% in their own homes or apartments that they rent. 2/3 of them are living in suburbs. We in Brookline tend to think in somewhat more urban terms, but the average older adult in America lives in a suburb, which means she or he are car dependent. And that's an issue when driving becomes more difficult.
Absolutely.
And one of the great advantages of living in age-friendly Brookline.
Right, depending on where. Brookline's pretty big.
Good point.
Has a suburban area. There's no question.
Yep, you're right.
And you probably run into some of the similar issues there. But there's no question. Brookline has the transportation. They have the support. They have the local support around in the community itself. And there's price. We have another issue, but we're not going to get into that at the moment. But we will, if not in this show, in the future shows. Yeah,
affordability is a huge issue. And just in a nutshell, the issue there is that the more desirable a community is, the more expensive it is to find housing there. And Brookline is an exemplar.
Can we get on to your background? Because center communities, I've been around, I've been with you in one of the sites, 1550. I've seen them constantly, when I go to the senior center, I'm constantly near center communities over in Center Street. Can we look into to that as an example?
Sure.
As a place that, why, when you brought center communities in, and it grew its presence and everything, what was it in Brookline that drew you?
Yeah, so actually, even before I became the CEO of Hebrew Senior Life, this deal was on the table. These 3 buildings comprising Center Communities of Brookline were so-called expiring use buildings, meaning the private owner had guaranteed affordability for a certain number of years. That term was expiring, and he could have turned them into market rate units. And being where they are in Brookline, that was the economically logical thing to do. The state and the town encouraged Hebrew Senior Life to step in to preserve the affordable housing, and we were willing to do it. The buildings were unlike the subsidized senior housing that Hebrew Senior Life had built. Jack Satter House in Revere, Simon C. Fireman Community in Randolph, 2 beautiful subsidized housing communities that would look market rate to anybody who didn't know otherwise. Right. The center communities of Brookline buildings were not nearly as nice as the two that we had built, but what they had going for them is an extraordinary location. Right. And what convinced...
if you look at that picture, if they can bring it back.
Sure.
The picture 1550.
This is one of the buildings right on Beacon Street next to Temple Beth Zion, and you can see that it steps from the T and Coolidge Corner in Washington Square, close to the movie theater, the bookstore, the butcher, the baker. I mean, there's no better neighborhood in the United States for an older adult to live in. And that's what persuaded us that these buildings were worth acquiring, 517 units. We spent over $12 million renovating them, and every penny went into the common space. We didn't spend money renovating the individual apartments, and when we were interviewing contractors, they said, gee, that's the opposite of what most people do. They spend money on the apartments, and then they put a plastic plant in the lobby and call it a day. This, by the way, is at 100 Center Street. This is the dining room. You can't see it here, but spectacular views of the Boston skyline from the dining room. What we realized is that if we created more common space, people moving here were not only getting a great location, but they would get the amenities of what was under the roof of the building they were living in. You saw a moment ago
why don't you bring that
the
back?
hairdressers. Now, I personally think that hair care is overrated, but you can tell why in my case. This happens to be a very popular destination at 100 Center Street. So something that people love about it is that they take the elevator down and they can have their hair done, or
Absolutely.
they can exercise with a guy who has his master's in exercise science, specializing in older adults. Or they can go to a class that is doing fitness. Or they can go to a medical practice that's right in the building. Or take advantage of any of the other common spaces.
I know those people.
I know this guy. So Matt, you and I are in a group at Temple Beth Zion, Wise Aging.
Right.
We happened to meet in 1550, one of the Center Communities of Brookline buildings. This is the library. And we meet there because the woman to the left of you, Suzanne Gelber, lives in that building. Instead of having us in her living room, she has us in the building's living room, so to speak. And from our perspective, it's no different than if we were in her actual home.
It's very pleasant.
So Suzanne, everything that you just saw there is part of what comes with the apartment that she rents. The trade-off is she's living in an apartment that is relatively small.
Right.
But what she gets in exchange for giving up some square footage
right.
is this amazing location and access to all of these community services. This, I think, is a very important trend in senior housing, where you'll see seniors living in smaller units that are more affordable, but with access to common space that extends their personal living space.
Yeah, that's, and I guess the ease of getting to the common space, the ease of using it. I mean, I noticed, for instance, with Suzanne, we came in one time and she wasn't there. She had us come there without her.
Right.
And the people asked, who are you? And we said, oh, we're Suzanne. Oh, hi, how are you?
Mm-hmm.
they welcomed us into the room again.
An architect once told me that the greatest transportation system ever invented is the elevator.
It is.
Billions of trips a year, and nobody ever gets hurt.
That's true.
And so when you're in a high-rise and you've got all of these different things, dining, a salon, medical practice, fitness center, coffee shop, computer lab, when all of that stuff is accessible by elevator, it's pretty convenient.
Now, what's interesting is on Center Street, that's also the senior center is located on Winchester.
Yeah.
And it's right near those.
In fact,
they have a back entrance, in fact, to the center communities.
It's the senior center, people may not know, is built on land that was donated by Roger Stern, who sold the Center Communities of Brookline to us. he wanted the senior center there, and he donated that property to the town of Brookline. So that's another great amenity. You've got the senior.
I was thinking there's a computer lab there.
Yep.
There's more fitness. There's card games with other people.
Yep.
There's
It's
programs, et cetera, et cetera. And you walk right out of the Center community. You walk right out of Center Street, and you walk through the back entrance, and it goes right in. It's all lit up. There's a little park-like area.
This, if you go to Western Europe,
right,
where the countries are much more advanced in how they support older adults, the Center Communities model is typical. They're called service houses, and they're buildings that provide services and residences not only to the people living in them, but to people in the entire neighborhood. And that was our model for Center Communities of Brookline, to not be cloistered and cut off from the neighborhood, but to welcome people in. And so the connection to the senior center helps, but the building is also open to outside groups. The more traffic that goes in and out of the building, the livelier it is and the happier are the people living there.
And I think it's still under growth and change. I mean, this is, it's clearly, it's just the time I've seen it. It's been expanding this communication and this communal atmosphere and the services that are available. I mean, people that come into Brookline, they come in two types. I mean, they can be retiring and they live in Brookline and they're trying to figure out where they live once they retire. They can be people who are already planning on staying in Brookline or moving to Brookline, right?
Right.
As they age, one of the things they look for, I think, is Brookline itself. What does it provide?
Right.
And we've showed the transportation. We know the transportation in Brookline. We know medical support. We know the theater that you pointed out. I think in future shows and everything, we'll get into more of the support that's available outside. And what are the other? Are there any other types of housing that's available than we've discussed? Is there anything else that we should be pointing out?
We've covered a lot of it. I mentioned very quickly continuing care retirement communities. They continue to be built, and these are generally market rate, somewhat upscale communities where people pay an entrance fee, and there are different levels of care should they require it. Something else that is happening around the country, college towns are attracting retirees, sometimes alums, but often non-alums, because housing tends to be cheap, they tend to be pretty safe, and then they get all of the cultural offerings that a college has.
I know people in Pennsylvania right near a college town, the same thing. So they moved from New Jersey to Pennsylvania in order to be near a college town. Exactly.
And then there's also a phenomenon that we certainly see in Boston for well-off seniors who are moving from the suburbs into the city because they want the amenities that the city offers. But the last thing I would say is the boomer generation eventually is going to swell the ranks of people 65 and over to around 80 million. That's a big number.
That's a very big
number.
And
boomers have been accustomed to breaking the mold at every stage of life. So we're going to see types of housing for older adults that are unique, that we've never seen before, because you're going to see people innovating in ways that we can't quite
I just see that one of the things the Senior Center had, and we had a show on it, trips for transportation, and people are exploring new ways of moving from driving, new ways, the kinds of things like Uber, the calls, the bridge, the transportation itself, moving from partially driving to so just in the area of transportation alone, new models, completely new models being developed.
Not to mention, we're not that far away from autonomous driverless cars, which will be a tremendous boon for older adults who are not comfortable driving.
You did mention Hebrew Senior Life being next to the synagogue. It's also not it's not required to be Jewish at all.
Oh no, Hebrew Senior Life serves seniors of all religions, all races, ethnicity, and so on. So it's a very diverse, which is Brookline, it's been wonderful. I'm no longer at Hebrew Senior Life, but I know that the people, the board, and the senior managers there are delighted to be citizens of Brookline. They're proud to be here. And I do believe, and this is something, even I'm no longer there, I said earlier, to me, Brookline is the exemplar of what older adults are looking for. And if you want to conjure up an image of what the World Health Organization had in mind when it started the Age-Friendly Cities Initiative, I would say that Brookline is as good as any place you're going to find in the world.
I live in a small, quick anecdote. I live in a relatively small unit because I had a big house at one time. So it's certainly small. It feels small to me. We have many of the things you described, but we looked to say, well, could we move to a larger place? And we would have had to leave Brookline.
Yeah.
And we turn around and say, we have a larger place. It's called Brookline.
Right.
And it gives us those things outside of our unit. It gives those things all around us. And our children were just looking at us like we were crazy because they couldn't understand why we'd even consider it. They were jealous, if anything. But,
so this is maybe a good note to end on if we're close to ending.
Yes,
which is that this gets back to the issue of what are you willing to give up in order to have Brookline? And a lot of people don't think of it this way, but in fact, it's very expensive to build housing.
Right.
You can't reduce the cost of construction. You can't reduce the cost of land. What you can reduce is the number of square feet that you insist on living in. And if you think about your living room as being the town of Brookline or the common spaces that we looked at Center Communities of Brookline, it's a way of reframing how much private space you need for yourself.
Absolutely.
And if you can liberate yourself from old expectations of what adequate living space is, your options will grow enormously.
Right. Well, I really want to thank you.
You're welcome, Matt. It's always wonderful
talking to you. It's an introductory show, but I really enjoyed the conversation. And
thanks for having me.
We'll probably continue it after this goes off. But let's say goodbye to everybody and thank everybody for coming and watching. The show, as usual, will be it'll be shown again and again after it's on. It'll be rescheduled on many times after the original showing, this showing. And in addition, you can look at the Brookline Can website, and you can find this show and all the previous ones. And also on Twitter and Facebook accounts for Brookline Can. All of these things will be available. Again, I want to thank you. We will have other shows. Perhaps you can come back, and we'll see where we go from here.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.